Ryan Waller was a brave survivor, with 2 bullet holes straight through his face. But our brilliant police couldn't see past the blood. Instead of saving him, they cuffed him, dragged him into hours of interrogation, and ignored every sign he was dying. That one reckless mistake cost him his brain. And the last 10 years of his life. Ryan Waller lived with his girlfriend, Heather Kwan, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Desert Hills, Arizona. They were both young and private, spending most of their time focused on school and each other. Ryan, a college student with a passion for firearms, kept to himself, while Heather, just 21 years old, was preparing for law school. She was known for her compassion, someone who spent her weekends volunteering with underprivileged kids and gravitated toward people who needed kindness most. The connection between Ryan and Heather worked because they shared a simple life rooted in peace and mutual care. That December, they had made plans to join Ryan's father, Don, for Christmas dinner. It was nothing extravagant, just a quiet holiday meal at home, something Don had prepared for and was looking forward to. But when the day came, Ryan and Heather never arrived. Don tried calling and texting both of them, but there was no answer. Hours passed with no response, and what began as mild concern quickly turned into dread. This kind of silence wasn't like them at all. Instead of going over to the house himself, Don contacted the local police and asked for a welfare check. When officers arrived at the home, nothing seemed obviously wrong at first. A single light was on, a car sat parked in the driveway, but no one came to the door. They knocked several times and announced themselves, but there was no response. They waited, knocked again, and called out louder. Just as they were preparing to escalate the check, they heard the deadbolt click. The front door slowly opened. Ryan stood in the doorway. The first thing officers noticed was the state of his face. His left eye was bruised so badly it had nearly swollen shut, and a cut ran across the bridge of his nose. But what stood out even more was his behavior. He didn't speak. He didn't seem curious or concerned about why the police were at his door. He just stood there, silent and dazed, staring through them as if they weren't even there. Inside the living room, just beyond where Ryan stood, officers could see a woman lying on the couch. Based on the welfare check request, they assumed it was Heather. When they asked about her, Ryan responded with only a few words, "She's sleeping." That was all he said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't turn to look at her. He didn't ask questions. His entire demeanor was distant and vacant. Officers told him they needed to check on her. At first, Ryan hesitated. He didn't argue or block them, but he paused for a few seconds, as if unsure of what to do. Eventually, he stepped aside and allowed them to walk into the house. What they found was not someone sleeping. Heather was lying motionless on the couch, cold and lifeless. A single gunshot wound to the head had killed her days earlier. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood trails, no indication of any fight. Just a dead woman in a quiet room and a boyfriend who seemed barely aware of what had happened. The decision was immediate. Officers placed Ryan under arrest. He didn't resist. But as they began walking him out of the house, Ryan repeatedly told them he didn't know what was going on. He asked what was happening. He seemed genuinely confused, not defensive, not panicked, just lost. Still, the officers didn't press for details. They didn't stop to reconsider the way he was acting. They didn't ask why he had bruises, why he wasn't protesting, why he couldn't answer simple questions. They assumed he was faking. He was handcuffed and placed in the back of a squad car parked outside the house. And then, he was left there. Ryan remained in that police car for 6 straight hours. No water. No food. No medical attention. No treatment for the obvious facial trauma. It was cold that night in Arizona, but no one offered a blanket. They figured his injuries had come from Heather defending herself. They chalked up his confusion to guilt or shock. They believed they had their killer, and they saw no reason to ask further questions. By the time they transported him to the Phoenix Police Department at around 5 a.m., Ryan had spent a full quarter of the day in that patrol car, still untreated. There was no ambulance. No nurse. No examination. Not even a single bandage. At the station, officers processed him for interrogation. His eye was still swollen, his skin pale, his posture weak. But again, no one stopped to question what was going on inside his body. They assumed the erratic behavior, the mumbling, the lack of answers, it all pointed to guilt. What they missed was staggering. He entered the interrogation room at 5:08 a.m. on December 26. There were no handcuffs on him, and nobody directed him where to sit. The room was bare, a simple table, 2 chairs, and a mounted camera recording every second. As he sat down, he noticed a single handcuff attached to the table. No one asked him to use it, but without hesitation, he reached for it and locked it around his wrist. Then, without saying a word, he folded his arms on the table, rested his head, and sat silently in that position for several minutes. Occasionally, he let out soft groans, as if his body was protesting something internally. But otherwise, he remained quiet and almost eerily still. He wasn't fidgeting, wasn't looking around, and didn't appear to understand where he was or why he was there. It was the behavior of someone completely disconnected from their surroundings, not someone strategizing or hiding guilt. 9 minutes later, Detective Dalton entered the room. His first task was to get photographs of Ryan's feet, for evidence purposes, so he asked Ryan to lift his legs onto the table. Ryan looked puzzled by the request, like he couldn't quite register what was being asked of him, but after a few moments, he complied. Another officer entered the room with a camera and a swabbing kit and spent the next 10 minutes collecting evidence from Ryan's feet, all while Dalton remained seated in the room. During the process, Ryan repeatedly asked if he could go home. He wasn't panicked, just calmly insistent, as if he genuinely had no idea why he was being kept there. When Dalton told him it wouldn't be possible, Ryan's demeanor shifted into frustration, the kind you'd expect from someone who had been grounded unfairly. There was no fear, no anger, just quiet confusion. Once the officer with the camera left, Dalton pulled his chair closer, sat down across from Ryan, and began the formal questioning. He started with the basics: name, date of birth, social security number. Ryan answered all of them correctly, though his tone was flat and his eye contact non-existent. Then came the real test. Dalton asked Ryan if he knew why he was being interrogated. Ryan simply said no. Dalton, trying to keep the conversation light and familiar, told Ryan he was going to read him his rights, just like they do on TV. He mentioned shows like Law and Order, hoping to trigger some recognition. Ryan stared at him blankly and said he didn't know what that meant. When Dalton followed up, asking if he'd ever seen any crime shows, Ryan suddenly backtracked and said, "Oh yeah, I've seen them." The shift was unconvincing. It didn't sound like a lie designed to cover guilt. It sounded like someone guessing what the right answer might be. Next, Dalton asked Ryan about his education. Ryan couldn't immediately recall how far he'd gone in school. After a pause, he guessed 8th grade. When asked if he had completed a GED, he said he didn't know. When Dalton asked if he could read or write, Ryan responded with another vague answer. "Yeah, I think so." From that point on, the confusion only deepened. When Dalton brought up Heather, Ryan denied having a girlfriend. When asked if he knew someone named Heather, he said yes, but then described her incorrectly. He guessed her age was 16 or 17 and said her last name was Kwan, though he wasn't entirely sure. The real Heather Kwan was 21, and she had no aliases or nicknames. To someone who didn't know better, Ryan's answers would seem evasive or dishonest. But for Dalton, who had been told Heather was dead and that Ryan was the only suspect, this sounded like a man trying to lie his way out of a murder charge. Then came the topic of Ryan's injuries. When asked what happened to his face, the large bruise around his eye and the gash on his nose, Ryan first claimed he didn't know. Then, when pressed, he said Heather might have hit him. A few questions later, he changed his story again, saying it was Richie and his dad who had attacked him. When Dalton asked what they used to hurt him, Ryan responded, "Bow and arrows." But seconds later, he corrected himself, "I meant revolvers." The inconsistency wasn't subtle. It was blatant and ongoing. Dalton continued trying to piece things together, but Ryan's story was unraveling. At one point, he said Richie and his father put him in a sleeper hold. But when asked what that meant, Ryan admitted he didn't know. Moments later, he abandoned the sleeper hold explanation entirely and went back to claiming they shot both him and Heather. Then, just as quickly, he claimed Heather was just sleeping. Every sentence contradicted the last. Every detail seemed made up on the spot. But then something happened. At 5:52 a.m., nearly 45 minutes into the interrogation, Dalton paused. He looked at Ryan more closely, leaned forward, and asked him to bring his face closer to the table. Ryan hesitated, said his head hurt, but eventually shifted forward enough for Dalton to get a better look. That's when he saw it. Not just bruising, but actual, physical holes. One in the bridge of Ryan's nose, one in the corner of his eye, another along the left side of his forehead. They weren't scrapes or cuts. They were wounds, precise, round, and deep. Without saying another word, Dalton stood up and left the room. What he had just realized, far too late, was that Ryan Waller hadn't killed anyone. He had been shot in the head. Twice. And he was still alive. A month before Christmas, Ryan Waller had kicked someone out of his home. His name was Richie Carver, and he had been staying with Ryan and Heather temporarily. But during that time, Richie crossed a line. He reportedly began making unwanted advances toward Heather. When Heather told Ryan, he didn't let it slide. He confronted Richie directly, and the situation escalated quickly. Eventually, Ryan forced him out of the house. Richie left humiliated. And that's where the revenge began. On December 23, 2 days before Christmas, Richie returned to the house, but he didn't come alone. With him was his father, Larry Carver. Together, they approached the back of the house just after dark. Ryan was inside when he spotted them through the glass of the back door. He ran toward the door, trying to stop them from coming in. But he didn't make it in time. As the door opened just slightly, Richie reached through the gap and raised a gun. He fired once, the bullet entered the bridge of Ryan's nose, passed through, and lodged behind his left eye, slicing into his brain along with fragments of shattered bone. As Ryan collapsed to the ground, unconscious, Richie fired again. This second shot grazed the side of Ryan's head, cracking his skull. To Richie and Larry, Ryan was dead. They stepped over his body and walked straight into the living room, where Heather was sitting on the couch. She had nowhere to run and no time to react. Richie pointed the gun at her head and pulled the trigger. One shot. It was and she was executed on the spot. After killing Heather, the two men didn't panic. They stole what they could from the house, small valuables, electronics, anything easy to grab, and then they left. No cleanup. No attempt to disguise the scene. They believed their work was finished. Ryan was gone. Heather was gone. There would be no witnesses. But they were wrong. At some point that night, Ryan regained consciousness. He wasn't fully aware. The damage to his brain had already started to affect everything: his memory, his speech, his logic, even his ability to process reality. But physically, he was alive. And he saw Heather on the couch. She wasn't moving, but in his broken mind, she didn't look dead. She looked asleep. Ryan didn't call 911. Instead, he simply stayed inside. He believed Heather was resting, and he convinced himself that if he just waited, everything would be fine. Over the next 48 hours, he wandered through the house in a fog. He went to the kitchen. He used the bathroom. He tried to go to bed. But all of it was happening under the weight of a fractured skull and a brain hemorrhaging from the inside. Heather's body remained on the couch. On December 25, Christmas Day, Ryan was still in the house, walking back and forth, unable to understand why Heather still hadn't woken up. That was the day police came to the door. When he answered, the officers took one look at his bruised face and disconnected responses and assumed the worst. They believed he had killed her and was now faking his way through the aftermath. What they didn't realize was that he was clinging to life. Instead of rushing him to a hospital, they handcuffed him and put him in the back of a patrol car. He stayed there for 6 straight hours. No food. No fluids. No medical attention. Then he was taken to the station and interrogated for nearly 2 more hours. The entire time, he was still suffering from 2 untreated bullet wounds. He sat under harsh lights, struggling to answer questions, unable to focus, drifting in and out of lucidity. Not until the end of the session, when the detective looked closely at Ryan's face, did anyone notice the entry wounds. That was when everything changed. An ambulance was called, and Ryan was rushed to the hospital. But by then, the damage had been done. Surgeons had to remove a significant portion of his brain in order to reduce swelling and extract the lodged bullet and bone fragments. The trauma had affected his optical nerves. Some reports said one eye was removed, others said both. But either way, Ryan lost his vision permanently. His life after the surgery was never the same. He moved back in with his parents, who became his full-time caretakers. He could no longer live independently, and the damage to his cognitive functions was permanent. For 10 years, he lived with the aftermath, the seizures, the limitations, the loss of everything he had before that December night. And then, it ended. A seizure, connected directly to the brain damage he had suffered during the attack, took his life. There was no dramatic scene. Just one more cruel outcome from a series of failures: the shooters who attacked him, the officers who overlooked him, the system that left him untreated for hours. Despite everything, no police officer was ever held accountable. An internal investigation was conducted, but it led nowhere. Ryan's parents never sued the department. They didn't ask for money. They didn't ask for revenge. They only wanted their son back. And nothing in the world could give them that.